Hello, Year 12 psychology students, and welcome to this recorded class on operant conditioning. We're doing something a bit different today, something called a flipped classroom. Basically, what that means is that instead of doing the learning inside of class and then doing an activity outside of class to reinforce that learning, we do the opposite of that. We do the learning outside of class and the activity inside of class. We will be asking for a bit of feedback in terms of how you thought this went, whether you found it was more engaging, that sort of thing. And we'll give you a bit more information about that when we come to it. All right. So just touching base with the situation so far in terms of the big picture of psychology. We have around about 14 weeks until the end of your exam, which will be on Thursday the 27th of October at 9 a.m. It's not long, but we still do have a bit of a ways to go, so it's important that we maintain the momentum that we started the year with. Just before we start with the topic for tonight, I wanted to touch on something called burnout, which a lot of ECE students at this time of the year experience. Sometimes it can show itself in symptoms such as a bit of a sense of helplessness, a bit of demotivation, a bit of fatigue, which if you have ruled out that not due to your diet, a lack of sleep or a lack of exercise. So any of not being affected by any of those, then it might be a bit of burnout. Even sometimes some anxiety can show up, which can also contribute. Yeah, these are all symptoms that you might be feeling if you're a little bit burnt out. If you are experiencing those things, come and have a chat with Miss Ball or myself and touch base. We'll have a bit of a discussion about what can happen in terms of that, and just in terms of looking after yourself while you finish these last few months. We'll have a bit of a discussion as just some general advice for the next few months. Look after yourself. You can come talk to Miss Ball about anything with reference to anything like meditation apps or anything that you can find on Android if you're interested. They can be very helpful. Exercising a lot, or not necessarily a lot, but just having regular exercise schedule, even if you incorporate exercise into your already existing study schedule, that can be helpful. Excuse me. Getting enough sleep is also pretty crucial. The National Sleep Foundation recommends about 9 hours of sleep for young adults. So if you're not getting that much sleep, you are missing out. So that means if you're waking up 7 o'clock every morning, you need to be going to bed around about 10 o'clock in the evening, which I'm sure the vast majority of you listening maybe don't do. So that's something that you can also look into addressing. Let's do a bit of a review before we start operant conditioning. So far we've learnt about classical conditioning, which involves reflexive and involuntary responses. Because of this, it doesn't really take into account learning that an individual actively partakes in, which is more about what operant conditioning is on about. In between the time that I've recorded this, Sunday night, and also when we'll be discussing this in class, you'll probably have learnt trial and error learning and the work of Thorndike. Trial and error learning is an alternative form of learning that does involve the individual, unlike classical conditioning. However, you can imagine that if we had to learn everything by trial and error, there wouldn't be many of us around anymore. So An example of that could be if we had to learn that drinking and driving were a bad combination, just by doing trial and error, you'd imagine that there'd be an accident somewhere along the line. So that's where social learning theory, and we'll probably look at the work of Bandura. Well, no, we will look at the work of Bandura. We might look at some of the real-world implications in terms of the TAC alcohol ads. The drink and drive, don't be a bloody idiot, or something like that. It was one of those ads. That's coming a little bit later on. Today's topic is operant conditioning. It's also known as instrumental conditioning. And basically it understands learning as occurring as a result of the consequence of an action. These consequences determine the likelihood that it will be performed again in the future. So effectively, the individual gives a particular response to a situation, and that response is either punished or reinforced. And the idea is that that punishment and reinforcement will affect the likelihood that it will be repeated. Okay, so the main researcher in this field is a behavioral psychologist by the name of B.F. Skinner. He developed a three-phase model of operant conditioning, which we'll look at in a sec. Just before we do, a few terms you need to be aware of. Positive and negative reinforcement, punishment, response cost, schedules of reinforcement, as well as we'll also have a look at some of the factors that influence the effectiveness of conditioning, both classical and operant. Okay, so a few terms. An operant is any response that acts on the environment to produce some kind of consequence. So effectively, we can imagine an operant conditioning meaning learning, as learning resulting from the response, whether it's reinforcement or punishment to a behavior. So if Billy in class puts his hand up and answers a question, he answers it very well. The teacher says, "Well done, Billy, that's a fantastic answer. Really well thought out." This obviously makes Billy feel very proud of himself. So Billy's more likely to put his hand up and answer the questions in class as a result of the reinforcement the teacher gave him. So the operant in this case would be Billy's question answering behavior, if that is the correct phrase to use. Okay, so the next word would be consequence. Consequence is an environmental event that occurs immediately after the response and determines whether or not the response will occur. By the way, all these definitions are from the Grievous textbook, John Grievous and Nicole Lech. So these are good definitions. So if you want to memorize these for the exam, let's go ahead and do that for the short answer section. It'll be fantastic. Good definitions. Okay, sorry, back to consequence. An environmental event that occurs immediately after the response and determines whether or not the response will reoccur. Okay, so reinforcement or punishment, whether positive or negative. Keeping in mind that with conditioning, positive and negative doesn't mean good or bad. It means you add a stimulus or you take away a stimulus. Positive, you add a stimulus. Negative, you take away a stimulus. We'll get to that in a sec. Okay. So, with Skinner's model of operant conditioning, he used 3 stages. Hence why it's called the 3-stage model. The discriminative stimulus, or D-stimulus, as we'll refer to it from now on, because discriminative is too much of a tongue twister for me, is the stimulus that precedes a particular response. it will signal the likely consequence of a behavior. Okay, so actually we'll get to an example in a sec. The next stage is the R stage, or a response. A response, so it's response, is a voluntary behavior that occurs in the presence of the D stimulus. And then the last stage is consequence, which is an environmental event that occurs immediately after the response. So effectively, the D stimulus, response, and consequence all combine to form the SRS model of operant conditioning that Skinner came up with. So let's, just as a real world example, so we can kind of clear this up in our heads, if we have an individual who has set a specific ringtone to a particular friend's name on their mobile, so whenever this particular friend called, this particular ringtone was heard by the individual. The D stimulus would be the unique ringtone, discriminative, so think they can discriminate from other ringtones because this one ringtone is unique to this friend. The D stimulus would be the ringtone. The response would be to answer the phone. Obviously, the friend has to answer the phone in order to get to the response. Get to the consequence. And then the consequence would be hopefully a pleasant consequence of being able to talk to the friend. So effectively, we've got that D stimulus or stimulus SRS model happening there. Another example could be if you open your freezer and in amongst the I don't know what you have in your freezer, I guess icy poles and frozen peas and possibly frozen chips as well, I don't know. That's what I have in my freezer. The D stimulus would be the ice cubes. So you see a tray of ice cubes in the freezer, and the discriminative stimulus would be you see ice cubes. If you then took them out and put them into a drink, which you've just poured, this would be the response, then you would experience the positive consequence of having a good, more refreshing drink because it's cooler. So, just the D stimulus is the ice cubes. They stick out from everything else in your freezer. You take them out and you put them in the drink. That's the behavior, which we're going to call the response. Then you would experience the pleasant consequence of having a cooler, more refreshing drink. So, that would be an instance of positive positive reinforcement because you are adding something into the mix. Yep. And it's making the drink cooler, not because it's good, because you're adding something which is good. Which in this case happens to be good. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, we can go over it in class. Just in case this turns up on the exam, the SRS model of operant conditioning can also be called the DBC, just for D stimulus, behavior, and consequence. SRS, DBC, same thing. So just in case you come across that in the exam and think, I don't know what DBC is. Yeah, it's the same thing as SRS. Okay, so how did Skinner discover this model? Well, he experimented with rats. He used something called a Skinner box, which effectively is a box with a lever on one of the walls. And what this lever would do is when it was pushed a certain number of times, it would release a food pellet into the food bowl of the rat. So the rat would eat it. So the rat would be reinforced after a certain number of pushes on the lever with food. Let's talk about that more in class, because I'll also have a video to show you. Okay, So if we have a look at comparing the reinforcement processes between classical and operant conditioning, the main difference is with classical conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus, which was the meat powder in the case of Pavlov, after being paired with the neutral stimulus, which was the bell, over multiple times, eventually leads to what is to become the conditioned response, salivation, being associated with what is now considered the conditioned stimulus, the bell. No surprises, we've seen this before. With operant conditioning, it's a little different. The operant, which is the behavior being shown by the individual, is either reinforced or punished. Reinforced or punished. And in this way, the behavior either increases or decreases in frequency. There are two types of reinforcement that we're going to look at. Positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement doesn't mean good. Positive reinforcement strengthens or increases the frequency or likelihood of a desired outcome by giving or applying a desired stimulus after the desired responses are made. So, let me say that again. Positive reinforcement does not mean good reinforcement. It does not mean giving something good or happy. It means you are giving something in order to reinforce that behavior, in order to increase the likelihood that this behavior will be repeated in the future. Excuse me. On the other hand, negative reinforcement strengthens or increases the frequency or likelihood of a desired outcome by removing or taking an undesired stimulus after the desired responses are made. So, let's have another look at that again. Once again, negative does not mean bad. It means taking something away. On the other hand, negative reinforcement, taking something away, strengthens or increases the frequency. It reinforces the likelihood, reinforces the behavior, and thus increases the likelihood that it will be repeated by taking away an undesired stimulus. So one example of this was when Skinner, I'm not sure if it's Skinner. I could be wrong with this, but I'll double check with Miss Ball and get back to you in class. Skinner electrified the floor of his Skinner box with the rats in it. Didn't hurt them. It was just mildly unpleasant. It was an unpleasant shock, not painful, but you know. And what the rat had to do was to push the lever in order to turn the shock off. That's negative reinforcement. So the rat pushes the lever, in order to turn off, to remove the adversive stimulus, the undesired stimulus of the electric shock. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. We'll go through some more examples in person when we meet in class. Okay, then we also have punishment. So these are the behaviors that we want to get rid of. Punishment refers to either the delivery of positive punishment,